Well, I welcome you to this January Faith Formation series here at Lakewood Presbyterian Church. I want to talk with you about Jesus of Nazareth, the essential man message and ministry. We've just celebrated our annual celebration of Jesus' birth, and I want to focus now on what was the basics about his human life, message, and ministry. Not the theology that the church has created about Jesus, but really, what did he say and do? What was his life like? So our goal for these four videos is to get a little clearer understanding of Jesus, his life, his ministry, the social and religious background in which his life swirled, and frankly, his essential religious teachings, the central religious teachings that came from his mouth. So how do we know anything about Jesus? What are our historic sources for Jesus? Well, primarily, it is the New Testament, the canon, that is the authorized 27 different documents that make up the New Testament portion of our Bible. They are what our church considers its sacred library, and that was a process that took many years and happened probably about 1700 years ago. Now, within those 27 documents, there are what we call four gospels, the good news. The gospel means the good news. Four different, what I'm going to call reports about the ministry and the teachings of Jesus. Four of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, the big question is, well, where did the material come from that helped Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John write their Gospels? Well, this is what the Bible scholars believe the way it happened. There was this original sort of oral history, just an oral history of the early Christians, the early Christian communities. The scholars think they call it the Q source, the Quell, which is German for source, and that they may have had something like 200 lines of material, 200 verses, or 200 writings, 200 small little writings about Jesus and what he said and did. And then from that, and from the stories that circulated among those communities, Matthew, Mark, and Luke sat down and wrote what really are sort of like biographies of Jesus. Now, there are four of them. Three of them are what we call synoptic gospels, and that is, they just sort of orderly lay out the life of Jesus from beginning to end, and what he said and did as his life unfolded. Now, the first gospel, most scholars believe that the Gospel of Mark, which is the shortest gospel, was actually the first gospel, the oldest gospel, and that Mark was composed of this Q material and then all of the oral stories that were floating around. Mark's gospel has the least theology. It just sort of reports what happens. There is no birth narrative of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. There's no birth narrative. It begins with John the Baptizer and his ministry that preceded Jesus, and then the baptism of Jesus. The other interesting thing about the first three Gospels is that most scholars say it looks like Jesus' ministry was about maybe 12, 14 months long. Not the usual 3 years that we presume, but they have his ministry about a year, maybe a year and a half, something like that. About half of John's gospel focuses on, get this, Jesus' final week. Half of the Gospel of Mark is about that last week of Jesus' life in Jerusalem. And if you read the Gospel of Mark, you know that the resurrection story is not at all complicated. Simply, the women come to the tomb appears to be empty, and someone there says to them, "Oh, he's not here. He's gone back to Galilee, as he said, and he's going to meet you there." There's no other theological speculation. He's not here. He went back to Galilee. He'll see you there. And that's how the Gospel of Mark ends. So that's the first one. And by the way, these synoptic Gospels, the first one, Mark, was probably written around the time that Paul the Apostle died, around the year 65. All the Gospels were written between the year 65 AD and basically 100, 110 AD. That means Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus would have occurred 35 years before the first Gospel was even written down. Okay? The second Gospel is Matthew. Matthew appears first in the New Testament, but it's actually the second oldest. Matthew, we believe, is a combination of what Mark wrote down and this Q material. So it just keeps building. These Gospels just keep building. Matthew has an interesting birth narrative of Jesus, and it starts out with this long line of names trying to prove that Jesus falls into the Davidic line, that he was that David, King David, was Jesus' ancestor through Joseph. Very little attention is given to Mary in that birth narrative. If you read the Gospel of Matthew, very little is said about Mary. Very little. A lot, it's all about Joseph and his dream. It also includes that wonderful story that we call the Epiphany, where the astrologers come from the east, having seen this constellation of stars or some sort of event in the skies that for them as astrologers symboled the birth of a great king. And then also the terrible story of the slaughter of the innocents under King Herod. Matthew is the source of the great Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaching the Beatitudes. That's in Matthew. And also, Matthew pictures Jesus as the new Moses. And it's in the Gospel of Matthew, all those sayings, you have heard it said, but now I say unto you, all those sayings. Or you've heard this, now I say. Matthew makes Jesus into this new Moses, the new lawgiver, the new person. He's the new Moses. And that Jesus, what Jesus said about God and all his teachings are the new Torah, the new law of God for the people. Then we come to the Gospel of Luke, the third one in our New Testament, and it is a combination of, again, that Q source material and then Mark and Matthew. So it just keeps building. Luke is if you're a person that's interested in social justice and the concern of the oppressed and the social outcast, Luke is the gospel for you, because Luke is the gospel that shows great concern and Jesus' concern for the outcasts and for justice for all of God's people, fairness, economic fairness, that sort of thing. Luke has the only story, this is very interesting, Luke has the only story in all of the New Testament, the only story that concerns Jesus that happened between his birth and his ministry. Remember the story? When he goes to the temple with his parents, he's 12 years old, and they lose him because he starts arguing with the priests and the scribes about the Bible. And his mom and dad, Joseph and Mary, get really upset with 12-year-old Jesus because they can't find him, and they get very upset about it. That is the only story in the New Testament that has anything to do with Jesus in the middle of his life, between his birth and his ministry. Luke also includes what I think are the most beloved parables. Think of it: the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, Lazarus. They are only in the Gospel of Luke. Then we come to the Gospel of John. This is the fourth Gospel in the New Testament. The Gospel of John is not considered a synoptic Gospel. In other words, the Gospel of John doesn't lay out the life of Jesus sort of in order. It's hit or miss, and it's less a narrative reporting than it is highly theological. Long passages, if you read it, long passages where Jesus is in prayer, and there's nobody there but Jesus. And the question that comes to me is, well, how did anybody know what he prayed? Okay, so that's the Gospel of John. It's highly theological. The Gospel of John also has that that wonderful first few verses, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, where a highly philosophical approach to who Jesus was. He was the eternal Christ that manifested as a human being for 30 years, named Jesus. Wonderful, wonderful theology there. And also, the Gospel of John has those I am metaphor sayings. I am the light of the world. I am, the life. I am the salt of the earth. Those sayings. That's in the Gospel of John. And then here's the other thing I want you to know about the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, you can clearly get a 3-year-long ministry of Jesus. That's where we get the idea that Jesus' ministry was 3 years and not one. Because the Gospel of John, and I don't know how the scholars do this, but they consider that ministry was 3 years and not one. Now, besides the New Testament, are there other sources to learn something about Jesus? Well, in the New Testament, there's the Acts of the Apostles. Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, appears for the first few verses, if you know the Acts of the Apostles, and blesses the disciples and then disappears. That's it. They say very little. Most of it is about Paul and Peter and their ministry. It says very little about what he said and did. It really does. And then there's Paul's letters. Paul says very little about the ministry and the teaching of Jesus. What does Paul talk about? Paul addresses and applies theological meaning to the death and resurrection of Christ. That's what the book of Romans is all about. It virtually says nothing about Jesus and his parables or his ministry of healing. It is how do we understand? What does Christ's death and resurrection mean for us? And then, of course, Paul also addresses issues and problems that were occurring in the churches that he founded. But there really isn't anything else about Jesus in Paul's letters. There really isn't. What about non-canonical writings? That is stuff outside of the Bible. Well, there are a few documents. One of them is something called the Didache, which was an early, like a primer, that had basic Christian teachings in it. It was never considered canonical or something that could be included in the Bible, but it was used by the early church and the early church fathers. It addresses things like the sacraments and those sorts of issues. And it does talk about Jesus and his ministry, but it was never considered a part of the Bible. And then there are these really interesting documents called the Gnostic Gospels. There are lots of them. And they were written by fringe groups within the early church who taught that they had special insider knowledge of Jesus and God, gnosis, special knowledge. And a lot of it is very esoteric. And Paul and others were always battling the Gnostics to try to keep them from introducing heresy into the early church. But there are a lot of Gnostic Gospels, and in those Gospels, Jesus does all kinds of really interesting and fun things that he didn't do in the other Gospels. And some of them included are Thomas and Philip. When I was in seminary, I did some research on the Gospel of Philip. Quite strange stuff. So it does. Some of these other writings do reference Jesus, but they're not a part of the Bible. Outside of those, they were sort of pseudo-Christian teachings. Outside of those writings, does anybody say anything about Jesus? Well, the answer is very, very little. But there's a couple, 3 or 4 powerful references to Jesus. The first one was by a Roman historian whose name was Tacitus. In one of his historical documents about Roman history, he references, he's talking about the great Roman fire of 71 when it was destroyed and the Jews were run out of Jerusalem. And he references Emperor Nero, who blamed it on Christus. He blamed it on Jesus and his followers. Now Jesus had died many, many years before, but clearly, for anyone who says there was no such thing as a man named Jesus, History says there was. And Tacitus, who was well regarded as a historian, said there was, and he calls him Christus, not Jesus, Christus and his followers, and that Emperor Nero blamed Christus and his followers on the fires and everything that happened in the Great Fire of Rome. And Tacitus also cites that Jesus, Christus, was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, which is what the Gospels say, which I think is pretty interesting and cool. So for those people who say Jesus of Nazareth is a figment of imagination, it is simply not true. It is documented in historical books. I found one other reference to Jesus in a letter written by a pagan, not a Christian, but a pagan whose name was Serapion. And in this letter, he's writing to his son. And he's talking about the execution deaths of 3 wise men. And he names them Socrates, Pythagoras, and then he says, and the Jewish wise king. And this is what Serapion said about the Jewish wise king and why we're convinced he was talking about Jesus. He said, what benefit did the Jews gain by executing their wise king? Shortly after, their kingdom was abolished. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in the fire. Serapion also says that the wise king lived on in his people by his new law, the law of love. The wise king lived on by the law of love that he gave to his followers. Clearly a reference to Jesus of Nazareth. In addition, the Jewish historian Josephus mentions Jesus twice. And he calls Jesus, or he cites in his work that Jesus was a sorcerer, which is what he was accused of being in the Gospels. That he was a person who used dark magic, manipulative magic for his own good, for his own evil purposes. That he was a sorcerer. That his miracles of healing and exorcism weren't truly gifts of God, but he was a sorcerer, and that he led Israel astray. And then Joseph also references Jesus, he's talking about Jesus' brother James, who was the bishop of Jerusalem, and so he refers to James, the brother of Jesus. So even Josephus references Jesus in these Jewish historical writings. And then finally, the Talmud. The Talmud is a sort of a book where scholars tease out the meaning of Scripture and the law in the Old Testament. And the Talmud, there are 2 references to Jesus in the Talmud, and again, they say he was the man who practiced magic and led Israel astray. So there certainly are not good remarks, but they certainly prove in a way that there really was a man named Jesus, a Jewish man named Jesus, who was a prophet, who did mighty acts, and that he was accused of being a sorcerer. So for those people who say there was no such thing as Jesus of Nazareth, they're dead wrong. They're dead wrong. All right, I think that is well enough. So those are the sources of what we know about Jesus. The 4 Gospels, whatever Paul said, whatever is in the Acts of the Apostles, and then some of these extra things. We can learn more about the social life and the cultural and religious life of Jesus from other sources, but in terms of the man Jesus, what we know about him is contained basically in the 4 Gospels, and that's what I want to tease out with you on these next 3 Sundays that follow. So I hope this is interesting, and I hope that you'll come back and join us again next Sunday when we continue this study of the essential Jesus, the man, his message, and his ministry. Have a great week.